on our country's history. So a little bit of background before I get started. Hernando de Soto is coming from Spain, and at the time, Spain is only a few decades out of a nearly 800-year-long war, a war of religion against the Islamic Moorish people that had conquered the Iberian Peninsula.
800 years?
Yeah. Yep. From the year 711 to 1492. So there's constant back and forth conflict going on. So you can imagine what's been happening over that time period of warfare is that weaponry and fighting tactics are all escalating to a fine point. So arguably, by the time De Soto's army gets here in 1539, they're probably one of the finest fighting forces on the planet. They've been honed from centuries of warfare and the knowledge of how to vanquish a conquering people like the Moors, who the Spanish adopted a lot of amazing technology from. So advances in steel making. They have the first, one of the earliest known firearms. It's called a matchlock arquebus. And generally we like to end our program with a bang to show you guys that, but we don't have access to it today, unfortunately. But we will show you guys a few interesting weapons that I think some of you guys will be interested in as well. So, so that's a little bit of context of where De Soto is coming from. And so you can imagine this elite fighting force. He comes here with nearly 1,000 people. He comes here with 220 horses. These are animals that have never been on this continent before. He comes over with 60 or more war dogs. And war dogs are animals like, very similar to the Spanish bull mastiff or Irish wolfhounds that are over 100 pounds, and they're trained to tear people apart on the battlefield. So they're really tough, nasty animals.
These are the horses?
They've got the war dogs.
Oh, the war dogs.
Yeah. So they've got this shining steel armor. They have what's known as Toledo steel. This is something that they again adopted from their Moorish conquerors. It's an advanced steel making technology, and I'll show you what that looks like in a little bit. And who do they meet here? They arrive here with this elite fighting force. They meet the prehistoric Native Americans, the Amerindians. So these are people that are basically in the Stone Ages in terms of their tools and technology. Now they're no less intelligent than the Europeans by any means. They're simply a little bit behind the development of materials. So so it's already an interesting contrast between the two. But to kind of talk about the Native Americans and those prehistoric people, I'll talk about an ancient hunting tool. And actually, to talk about this, we'll go all the way back to the Ice Age. So if I were to, young man, if I were to throw this overhand as a weapon, what would you call that? Like a spear, right? Yeah, spear and arrow. Yeah, this one looks like an arrow for sure. So people are hunting some of the largest land mammals that have walked the face of the planet during the last ice ages on this continent. So they're hunting the woolly mammoth, they're hunting mastodon. They're really peculiar animals during the ice ages. An animal called a glyptodon, which is like a kind of like an armadillo, but it's about the size of a Volkswagen Bug. So there's a giant ground sloth, which is not like the little three-toed sloth that you've seen hanging in trees in the rainforest that's kind of cute and slow-moving. The giant ground sloth is larger than a bull African elephant. And people are hunting these animals with hand-thrown spears. And you have a range with a spear of maybe 30 yards to injure an animal enough to hopefully kill it. But an animal that's that large at 30 yards, can just turn around and just step on you practically. Or, in the case of a mastodon, maybe tear you in half with 6-foot tusks once it's been injured. So it's kind of a daunting task to actually try to hunt something like that with
Sounds ridiculous.
Yeah, it does almost sound ridiculous. So the objective is to get yourself as far away from that risk as possible. And what people do is they use their minds to imagine a way to do that. And what the native people here do a long time ago is discover an element of physics. They've discovered mechanical advantage, and what they do is they create this addle. So that's pronounced ATL, or it's spelled ATL, pronounced addle, or atladdle. Either way, you can just think of it as a spear thrower. But basically, it's a stick with a notch on the end of it, and that notch corresponds to the back of a spear. And it's a modified spear. The spear has fletching like an arrow, so it flies straight. Because now that 30-yard range of the spear is multiplied at least 3 times. So this can go 100 yards or more.
It's like a slingshot effect kind of
right,
thing.
exactly. So,
Yeah.
and just to show you guys how that the mechanics work, I'm going to fling this at that little target, but the way to properly throw an addle is with a full body throw, like a baseball pitcher's fastball windup. So you'd be something like this. And since I can't do a 100-yard throw in this range, what I'm going to show you is just the effectiveness of this. I'm just going to push it with the muscles of my wrist. I'm just going to flick my wrist at the target to see what happens.
Wow.
Hey! So that's just this motion here.
That's impressive.
So if you really get behind it, you can imagine how far that thing will go. Today, people are taking this up as a hunting hobby, and they're using addle darts with modern materials, and they can send them 300 yards downrange.
Holy smokes.
So, but maybe you're wondering, why am I talking about a prehistoric, hunting weapon from the Ice Ages when we're talking about Hernando de Soto only 500 years ago, not 12 to 20,000 years ago. Well, when the Spanish arrive here, they also find themselves on the receiving end of these addle darts. There's a gentleman by the name of Juan Ponce de Leon. Does that name ring a bell? Mm-hmm. So yeah, he's the first Spanish to land in Florida in 1513. He's killed by an addle dart in 1521. The Spanish account says that it goes into the deep meat of his leg, and they describe it as an arrow of some 4 to 5 foot in length. And we know that that's way too long of an arrow to be shot from a longbow. That was an addle dart. But there are other accounts where the Spanish describe these addle darts going through the sides of boats into soldiers. So you can kind of imagine the force that it takes to go through the side of a boat. So that's our addle dart. That's our prehistoric weapon on the Native American side, meeting that really awesome fighting force that arrived here. So let's see, what else can we talk about? You talk about a prehistoric people, and that often conjures up, the guy with the big brow and the bare skin, and he lives in a cave, and he just carries a stick and knocks people on the head. And sure enough, people here were using sticks as weapons. We call them a war club, but there's actually it's not as crude a weapon as you might think. It's not just a stick that they found on the ground and they pick up and start wielding with each other. There's actually a lot of purpose behind it. So they're looking for some very specific type of wood that has a very dense grain, and they're looking for a feature on the end of either the root or the branch called a burl, where the wood grows in on itself, and it's very dense and usually makes a rounded kind of shape. And they can make that into an almost perfectly spherical shape at the end of an elegant stick. This is just a very crude example that an archaeologist made for us to demonstrate the fire hardening process. So this has been around in our camp for many, many years and has not suffered any kind of rot of any kind. But basically it's a piece of root, and with the fire hardening process, what they do is they bury their chosen piece of wood underneath a large fire. It wicks out the moisture. It makes it disease and rot resistant, and so this ends up being something that can be handed down from generation to generation. But as I mentioned, this is a very crude example. This is something that somebody kind of did as a project. If you were to find the ones that were found in archaeological sites, you'd see an almost spherical ball at the end, almost like a baseball on the end of a kind of majestically curved handle. So they're really items of beauty, but they are weapons, and they're pretty crude weapons nevertheless. With Native American society, it's not necessarily a killing weapon. This is something that a warrior with great control would be able to show that he's subdued his attacker. He's kind of knocked them senseless with this thing, but he hasn't killed them necessarily, because that can show a lack of control to kill somebody without a great purpose. So what you might do once they're knocked senseless is take a bit of their nose or maybe a notch of their ear, and you have evidence that you've beaten them, and they certainly show that they've been beaten. But they live to see another day. You haven't created a blood debt from one family to the next that has to keep going back and forth with people killing each other. So it's a very crude weapon. Now, we talked about all the advances that the Europeans had at the time that the Spanish were bringing over. They've got the first firearm. They've got this great weaponry and horses. Are they still using clubs at this point in time in Europe? You might not think so, but they really are. I mean, it's called a mace, but that's all it is. It's just a big bashing instrument, a club. So it's just a chunk of iron on the end of it. Now, here's the difference between these two very crude weapons. You know, the Native American, not necessarily a killing tool. This is absolutely a killing instrument. This is meant to crack through the armor of the day of Europe to deliver enough energy with this mass that even if there's armor, that energy is going to go through to the bone underneath and splinter that. And they've even made it a little nastier by adding these little holes on the side of it. You guys have any guesses what the holes might be for to make this a nastier weapon? What do you think?
To make it go faster.
To make it go faster? That's a good guess. We get that a lot, actually. But you know what? Aerodynamics and that kind of stuff, it wasn't necessarily a concept back then, but it's a good guess. The holes would accommodate things like rusty nails or shards of metal or chain, so that even if you haven't killed them right off with your blow, you introduce something nasty into their skin that's going to cause infection. And of course, a time without antibiotics, you get some rusty metal in your skin. You're not long for the world, right? So again, you have two very crude instruments, different purposes. One, not necessarily a killing tool. The other, definitely a killing tool. All right, so we talked about Toledo steel. Let me show you what this is. This is a sword actually made in Toledo, Spain, Toledo steel. So this is a revolutionary weapon for its time. It's a big improvement on the other medieval weapons, and the revolutionary property is this. It's flexible, it's resilient. So earlier swords of the Middle Ages looked like this big clunker right here. This guy weighs about 3 times the weight of the Toledo blade here. And then you hear this sound on that old blade. It's a nice ring and it's a nice Hollywood sound effect, but what it means is that the metal is very brittle. Over time, when this weapon slams into other swords and other armor, it develops micro fractures all along the blade, and ultimately it's going to break on somebody during battle. And that's the worst thing to happen in the middle of battle, to have your sword break, right? The next thing you're going to lose is probably your head. So this is resilient enough to last battle after battle, to where it ends up being a weapon that's handed down from generation to generation. So you have family crests emblazoned on these things that are just lasting forever. So De Soto's one requirement of all of those men is that they all own a sword and know how to use it. So all of his soldiers have the Toledo blade. So now, okay, well, if you're on this continent and you don't have access to metal and blacksmiths and that sort of thing, can you make a sword? You think you can, huh? Okay, well, you might be right. So this is what's called the Calusa War Saber, and this is the Native Americans' version of a sword. And the interesting thing about this is that this has nothing to do with their exposure to European swords. This is something that they came up with independently on this continent based on their own conflicts with their own neighbors. So the Calusa people, also known as the shark people, you recognize what's on the top of this? Shark. Yeah, so those are shark's teeth, right? So these happen to actually come from the tiger shark. So that the tiger shark, if you probably have watched Shark Week and the like. So those animals can eat just about anything they want. They've got the teeth that are designed to do that. They can eat sea turtles, large marine mammals. They can eat car tires. They've been found with metal objects and license plates from cars in their stomachs. So tiger sharks have the teeth that allow them to do that. They're naturally serrated and razor sharp. So the Calusa people, as I mentioned, also known as the shark people, would hunt for sharks. And once you fed your family with all the meat of a bunch of large shark, you also have hundreds of these razor sharp items ready to make into a tool. So what they've done is lashed them to what might have been a war club, and now they have a hacking and slashing instrument. So not going to be fun to be hit by one of those things. So that's the
How did they
war saber.
How did they get them to stay in there?
Sure. So animal sinew, and they also can drill holes. So they can drill holes to lash the sinew together, make a little pocket in the wood, and they also can make an epoxy of a kind, so that it sits almost in a resin, lashed there with sinew. So it's going to stay there for a good while. So interestingly enough, this is a very close reproduction of something that was found at an archaeological site not far from here. So it was in the muck, the oxygen-free environment, the mangrove muck pulled out, and this looks almost exactly like the actual artifact. But those things, because they were free of oxygen, the wood doesn't break down, so you're still seeing the little details of some things still had paint on them when they're pulled up out of that environment. All right, so let's talk about the pinnacle weapon of the Native Americans. And of course, that would be the longbow. You guys are probably familiar with that. It's a pretty iconic tool of the Native Americans. Let me go ahead and string this. So Native American boys would be given their first longbow at the age of, how old's the youngest of you guys?
5.
The boys. You're 5?
No. She's 5. She's 8.
Okay. So at the age of 8, the Native American boys are given their first longbow. And right off the bat, it's their homework. So this is what you do every day as homework, is to go practice with your bow and arrow. And you're going to play games with it. There's a game, an example of which is in the visitor center. It's a game called Chunky. There's a hockey puck shaped and sized stone. It's right in there behind glass. You can have a look at it when you get a chance. And the object of the game is on a 50-yard, smooth level course. Somebody's going to roll that stone down the course, and you're to run alongside it and try to fire at it. If you can hit it with your arrow, those are points. Or if you're at the starting point and hit the finish of its roll around 50 yards down range, you can hit its final resting spot. Those are also points. So you can kind of get an idea how good you have to be to play that game. So, but early on, the boys are asked to contribute to the family meal. They're hunting small game like rabbit and squirrel. There are other games as well that they play. They would place a hoop into a tree, and they're to fire the arrow through the hoops. And many of these games are actually played through adulthood and actually used to win arguments between families. So our best chunky player goes against your chunky player, and whoever wins the argument. So sometimes a blood-free way of conflict resolution there. So, but so the native boys are using these all their lives. When they're given their first longbow, it's their height plus another hand or two, so it's a little bit taller than the boy is. As the boy grows, he gets a new longbow to accommodate his height. But by the time he's an adult, he knows how to make his own bow, his own arrows, fletch. It's his right into adulthood to become a warrior, to make his own bow. And by the time he's made his own, he is expert at it. He can just look at something and shoot it, and he's going to hit it. He's been using it that long, and he's that accurate with it. So the Spanish end up having tremendous respect for the Native American archers. They would document that Native Americans could nock and fire 15 arrows in 30 seconds time. And of those 15 arrows, 13 are guaranteed to hit their target. And you guys will see I'm kind of all over the mark a little bit because I haven't been doing this, but this will prove a point later on in the talk. But one of the other things that I think is really interesting about the Native American archers, the Spanish would document one more thing, which is that where the arrows hit their targets, they often go as deeply as a European crossbow, which is usually a much more powerful weapon. So that points out an interesting difference between the two cultures to me also, is that, as I mentioned, the longbow is taller than the boy. So as a 6-foot adult, this is actually too small for me. And on average, that's who the Spanish are finding. They're finding Native Americans on average 6 foot tall or taller. Whereas they're coming over here on average height of 5'2". They're little guys from Europe at this point. So these are big big Native Americans that they're dealing with here in Florida. So this is that may equate to why that arrow goes as deeply as it does. That the Spanish are saying it goes as deep as a European crossbow. For a person my size, I'd have a much more powerful bow. This is maybe about a 40-pound pull. So let's show you the European counterpart. Again, it's bow technology, but it's modified. Now, of course, the Europeans have bows and arrows. They've had that for centuries, but it's kind of going out of style because of the arrival of this weapon. So this is a crossbow. And I'll show you how this thing works in a little bit here. But the advantage for the Europeans of this is that it takes all the years and years of training that it takes to become expert with the longbow. That's out of the picture because now you have this consistent aiming platform. So here's your bow, and now it's made out of that Toledo steel, so it's very powerful. You'll see this funny little shape here at the end. This is called a stirrup, because I've got to put my foot into it to get the leverage that I need to pull back the string, because this is about a 100-pound pull here. But the other, already you see a disadvantage of this weapon. It's a little bit more awkward to use. It's not nearly as elegant and as rapid firing as the longbow. I've got to get in this position. Look what's vulnerable here while I do this, You can imagine if you're under fire, under attack of Native American arrows, where those arrows might be targeted when you're in that vulnerable spot. So, you'll hear the difference though when this hits the target. Yeah, and it actually has a kick, almost like a gun. It's pretty powerful. So, the other advantage of this is that without much training at all, you can become pretty accurate with it. I usually can put those bolts right on top of each other.
Nice.
Right, so they're pretty much right on top of each other, right both in the bullseye. And again, I haven't been using this much at all. I only do this seasonally with the National Park Service. Whereas my longbow arrows are kind of all over the place. These are all right on target. So that's the advantage there. So, the De Soto expedition has a huge impact on the Native Americans. And you might wonder, did they just kill an awful lot of them? What happened? Well, if you think of the scale of what was happening here, they're here for 4 years, they go 4,000 miles, they bring nearly 1,000 people. All in all, from what we can tell, what the Spanish document, they only killed maybe in conflict about 3,000 Native Americans. So that's not really enough to make a difference on a population that's been estimated in the southeast of 20 million Native Americans, right? So what happened with the expedition? Why was it so influential? Well, there's something that De Soto brings, which is not actually a weapon at all. It's something that he brings as a convenience for himself and his expedition. That ends up being devastating to Native Americans. You guys have a guess what that might be?
Disease?
Well, it is absolutely it's disease, and it's brought by the domesticated swine that he brings. He brings about 400 pigs over here, and if you know much about pigs, they are incredibly reproductive. They're on the order of rabbits, so. These things get loose a little bit and they become feral within a generation or two, so they're already wild doing their thing out in native habitat. they carry a lot of diseases that are common to us. We can give the pigs the flu, they can give us the flu. You guys remember the swine flu from 2009? That killed 12,000 Americans in a time of modern medicine. So that animal had never been on this continent before. Imagine what happens when that animal is traveling, the duration, the 4 years and 4,000 miles of De Soto's expedition, and is in contact. The native people are enslaved to take care of that animal all along the way. They're also finding that it's a good meal. Everything's on the menu for Native Americans, and so is the pig when it gets here. There's in fact references of the De Soto expedition where their Native Americans are actually breaking into camp to steal pigs to eat them. It's, who doesn't like bacon, right?
Right.
So, but nobody knows how to not eat it if it's not cooked to 165 over an X amount of period of time, right? And the hogs carry at least a dozen diseases that are still directly transmissible to us today. And these people have no resistance to it whatsoever. Whereas Europeans, they've been raising hogs for centuries. They've been living in close proximity. They have a degree of immunity to all those diseases. So here's the shocking statistic. 150 years after De Soto's expedition, 98% of that 20 million population is wiped out. It's gone.
Really?
Absolutely. So between 95 to 98%. So that's the biggest legacy of De Soto's expedition, is that he brings these non-native animals here, and they're still here causing billions of dollars of destruction each year to natural areas and agricultural concerns. To this day, the hogs are in every state but 13. But later on, when French and English colonists come to explore the United States, what becomes the United States, that population isn't there to present a resistance. Imagine how our history would be different if that 20 million strong population was present. And they're simply not. They're there in the numbers of a few 100,000 at the point of Plymouth, etc. So that's the legacy of De Soto's expedition. Thank you very much. That's my presentation.
Good job.
Good job. Thank you.